The sun sagged low over the Badlands north of Arroyo Ford, its light a cold blade slicing across the jagged ridges. Wind swept dust in restless waves, stinging the skin and filling every crack in the earth. This was not a kind land. It offered no shade, no mercy, and no forgiveness. Teya Windriver moved along the narrow ridge, her steps uncertain, but proud, the broken breath of fear never leaving her chest. 3 men followed close behind Darek Flintfang Rafe Hollow Trail and Bran Iron Ridge, their voices sharp as spurs. They'd caught her earlier near the trading route, accusing her of stealing, though she had taken nothing. Their anger wasn't about theft, it was about power. And the ridge, with its steep drop into the basin below, was where they meant to prove it. Teya was 24, her skin the warm bronze of the desert sun, her long black hair tangled by dust and wind. The soft deerskin dress she wore, once proud with beads and fringe, now hung torn and tired from the years of wandering. Her family had been scattered, her father Håkon Redclaw, taken by soldiers, her mother Sahi Moonpetal, gone long before that. All that remained was the small beaded pouch hanging at her throat, sewn by her mother's hands, the last thread connecting her to a life lost to fire and fear. They wanted to see her beg. She met their hatred with silence. Even when Darek pressed his palm to her shoulder, forcing her toward the edge, she kept her eyes cold. The shove came sudden, hard, and final. Her foot caught on a stone, and the world spun as she fell. Sharp rocks tore at her body before she struck the basin floor. A scream ripped from her throat, swallowed by the empty wind. Pain flooded her senses. Her right leg bent, wrong bone cracking through skin. She tried to move, but agony pinned her where she lay. Above her, the 3 men lingered just long enough to be sure she wasn't getting up, then turned away. Their boots scraped stone. Then silence. Teya clawed her fingers into the dirt, fighting to stay conscious. The seam of her dress had torn open at the chest, and she pulled it together with shaking hands. Each breath came shallow, every movement a war against the pain. The sky burned orange, then bled to purple as hours dragged on. She thought of her mother's gentle voice, her father's steady hands, both ghosts now. By the time darkness settled, she had given up hope of seeing another dawn. Her mind drifted in and out, until the sound of hooves broke the stillness, slow, measured steps against the slope. At first she thought it was them again, but the rhythm was different, steady, deliberate. Out of the gloom came a horse, its reins held by a tall man in a dark coat, his shoulders broad, his stride sure, but heavy. The firelight of sunset caught his face. Brown hair brushed with gray, a scar running along his jaw like a story carved in flesh. His name was Kainan Wolfstep. He hadn't come looking for anyone. Kainan lived alone on the edge of the basin, a quiet rancher who spoke little and kept to himself. 3 winters past, he'd buried his wife Lyra Sunvale and their small boy Tika Frostleaf behind his cabin. Since then, his world had shrunk to wood dust and silence. When his eyes met the broken figure at the bottom of the ridge, his first instinct was to ride on. But something in her stillness stopped him. She wasn't just another body, she was breathing barely. Alive. Kainan led his horse closer, crouched beside her, and brushed away the dust from her face. She flinched, clutching her torn dress. He didn't speak. Words had long lost their comfort to him. Instead, he slipped his arms beneath her, lifting her gently but firmly. Her cry tore through the quiet night, and he winced, jaw set, as he carried her to his horse. He mounted behind her, holding her steady as the horse climbed the trail back toward the basin. Every step jarred her wounded leg. Every breath trembled in his arms. The faint scent of smoke clung to his coat, the smell of his lonely cabin waiting in the dark ahead. When they reached it, he pushed open the rough wooden door. Inside the place was humble, a stove, a table, a single cot near the fire. The boards groaned beneath his boots as he laid her down and turned away to gather what he needed, strips of cloth, splints, and an old tin of salve. The wind howled outside, cold and cruel. Inside, under the dim light of the fire, the quiet began the first fragile thread between a man who had stopped believing in life and a woman who refused to die. His hands were rough from years of hard work, mending fences, breaking wild horses, cutting rope, but they moved with the steadiness of a man who knew pain well. Kainan Wolfstep pulled Teya Windriver's leg straight, the crack of bone alignment echoing against the wooden walls. She bit down on her lip, fighting the scream that clawed at her throat, one hand gripping the pouch of her mother's beads as if it were life itself. "Hold still," he muttered, his voice low, deep, and rasped by dust and years of silence, the first words he'd spoken to her. He bound the splint with strips of cloth, tied it tight, then wiped the sweat from his brow. Teya's face was pale under the flicker of firelight, her breath shallow and fast, but her eyes still burned with the same defiance that had kept her alive. Kainan noticed it and paused just for a moment. Then he set a tin cup of water beside her and moved toward the stove, where a small pot of beans simmered. He sat at the table, his fingers unconsciously brushing the chain beneath his shirt, the ring of his dead wife, Lyra Sunveil, pressing against his chest. Memories crept in, uninvited, her laughter, her touch, and the fever that had stolen both her and their little boy, Tika Frostleaf, 3 winters ago. He had buried them in the frozen earth behind this cabin, carved their names into wood, and never looked back. Now, another life lay broken on his cot, and he didn't know what that meant for him. Across the fire, Teya watched him quietly. Her body throbbed with pain, but under this stranger's roof, she felt a faint thread of safety she hadn't known in years. He hadn't spoken more than a few words, hadn't touched her, except to save her life. That alone meant something. She pulled the blanket higher over her torn dress and turned her face toward the fire. Outside, the wind clawed at the walls, but inside, the only sounds were the steady pop of burning wood and the rhythm of their breaths. Neither spoke. Yet, something unspoken hung between them, an understanding forged not by words, but by survival. He had carried her when he didn't have to, and she had allowed it. That fragile, unspoken trust filled the silence. The night deepened over the basin, the wind rattling the shutters as the fire cast its faint glow across the room. Teya drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, her hand never leaving the pouch of beads. Hunger gnawed at her belly, but pride kept her quiet. At the table, Kainan ate slowly, each movement deliberate. The revolver rested beside his plate, close as habit demanded. He didn't look at her, but he felt her eyes on the food. Without a word, he filled another tin plate, walked to her side, and set it within reach. Her pride wavered. For a moment, she only stared at it, torn between dignity and need. He stepped back, eyes averted, giving her the space she needed. Teya pulled the blanket tighter and began to eat in silence. The beans were plain and burned on the edges, but they were warm, and that warmth reached deeper than her stomach. Once she caught him watching her, but he looked away just as quickly. When she finished, her strength drained. Pain pulsed through her leg, but her voice came steady. "Why didn't you leave me there?" Kainan lifted his gaze, and in his dark eyes she saw something she didn't expect. Not pity, but understanding. "Couldn't," he said simply. He didn't explain further, but she saw the truth in the set of his jaw. He had left someone once, or lost them, and couldn't bear to repeat that mistake. Her eyes lingered on the glint of the chain around his neck. The ring beneath it, small and worn, told her what his silence would not. He stood, grabbed his coat, and stepped outside to gather wood. The door closed with a heavy thud, the wind rushing in his absence. When he returned, his arms were full of fresh logs. He stacked them near the hearth, stirred the fire, and sat back down. This time the quiet between them no longer felt empty. It felt deliberate, respectful. "My mother's beads," she whispered suddenly, voice soft as the crackle of the fire. "I carry them always. They're all I have left." He nodded once, slow and wordless. That small gesture acknowledgement, without intrusion, was more kindness than she'd known in months. When the flames died low, Kainan stood and crossed the room. He took the blanket from the untouched bed against the wall and laid it gently over her shoulders, careful not to meet her eyes, to meet. Then he sat in the wooden chair by the table, leaned back, and closed his eyes. He didn't lie in his bed, and she understood why. Grief lived there. Teya stared at him through the dim light, her fingers wrapped around the beads. For the first time since her fall, she believed she might live through the night. By dawn, a pale strip of light slipped through the cracks in the cabin walls. The fire had burned low, but Kainan was already up, setting water to boil his movements, steady quiet as the morning itself. Kainan Wolfstep moved with the quiet precision of a man long accustomed to silence. Every motion was purposeful, shaped by years of routine. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. He checked the binding around Teya Windriver's leg, gave a small approving nod, and said simply, "Still holds." He poured water into a tin cup, placed it beside her, then asked in his rough, unhurried tone, "Pain?" Teya nodded once, her face tightening. He reached for a small tin box on the shelf, rummaged inside, and pulled out a pouch of dried willow bark. Bitter, he warned, handing it to her. "Chew it." She obeyed, grimacing at the sharp, earthy taste, but the gesture struck her more deeply than she expected. He had thought ahead, prepared for her pain, as if he'd known it was coming. Her eyes followed him while he moved about the stove, his broad shoulders filling the dim cabin light. He wasn't a man who sought company, yet here he was caring for her anyway. As she watched, a strange realization crept in. She was no longer wondering if he would send her away, but rather when she might find her place in this quiet space that had suddenly become her refuge. The scent of smoke and coffee clung to him, the same smell that lingered from the night before when he'd carried her through the cold dark. The image returned to her in flashes, his arms strong beneath her, the sway of the horse, the ache that burned through her leg with every jolt. Now morning light crept through the cracks of the cabin walls. Smoke hung heavy in the air, mingling with the smell of boiled beans and scorched coffee. Teya stirred awake, confusion clouding her for a heartbeat before memory returned the ridge, the fall, the man who hadn't left her to die. Kainan stood at the stove, moving like a man bound by habit. He poured coffee into one tin cup, filled another with hot water, and stirred the pot as if every action tethered him to the world. His back was broad, his flannel shirt worn thin, and his posture told of years spent alone. Even when he turned slightly, his gaze never met hers. Teya studied him carefully, her guard raised. Why had he helped her? What did he want in return? She'd known men before, men who took what they wanted and left ruin behind. She kept the blanket high around her shoulders, unwilling to show weakness. When he finally spoke, his words were simple. "How's the leg hurts?" She replied, her tone steady but challenging, as though daring him to care. He nodded once. Splint held through the night. "That's good." He set a cup of water and a small piece of bread beside her. "Eat." He didn't wait for thanks. Didn't ask if she wanted more. Teya ate slowly, hiding her hunger, though the plain bread and beans felt like warmth, settling into her bones. The silence stretched, pressing against her thoughts. Finally, she broke it. "Who are you? Why do you live out here alone?" Kainan hesitated, then answered without looking up. "Kainan Wolfstep, rancher. Got some land up the slope, cattle fences, that's all." But she wasn't satisfied. "Your family," he stopped moving. His jaw tightened as his hand brushed the chain beneath his shirt, the small silver ring pressing against his chest. "Buried them," he said quietly. "Wife. Boy. Fever. 3 winters back." The words landed like stones in the room, short, hard, and final. He didn't look at her, and she didn't ask again. Some silences weren't meant to be broken. Teya turned her gaze to the fire, understanding his quiet in a way few could. She too had lost everything, her father Hokan Redclaw, her mother Sahi Moonpetal, her tribe scattered and gone. The beads at her neck were all that remained of her people. And now her broken leg had bound her to this man's cabin, 2 shattered lives colliding in the same lonely place. When Kainan finished eating, he stood and reached for his coat. "Gotta check the line. Won't be long." He opened the door, cold wind rushing in. Fear spiked in her chest at the thought of being left alone. "If the men come back," she asked quickly, her voice sharper than she meant. He paused, eyes flicking toward the revolver on the table. "They won't set foot in here," he said evenly. "Not while I'm breathing." The certainty in his voice eased something deep inside her. He stepped out, shutting the door behind him. The wind whispered against the walls. Alone again, Teya listened to the creak of the boards and her own heartbeat. She tried to sit up, but pain shot through her leg, forcing her back down with a hiss. Frustration burned in her chest. She hated needing anyone. Her eyes fell on a shirt hanging from a peg. She pulled it on over her torn dress, the scent of smoke and leather wrapping around her like a ghost of him. It unsettled her, but it also made the cabin feel less cold. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, for the first time, she felt something she hadn't known in a long while: safety. Teya Windriver studied the cabin with quiet eyes, tracing the small world that now sheltered her. The untouched bed stood neatly made against the far wall, its blanket folded with military precision. The table bore knife scars from long years of use. On the shelf, a few jars of beans flour and coffee lined up in perfect order. Everything here was simple, functional, and spoke of a man who lived alone, with no one left to soften the space but himself. Her gaze lingered on the empty bed. She wondered if Lyra Sunvale had once slept there, if a small boy named Tika Frostleaf had once played across these same wooden floors. The thought hollowed her chest in a way she knew too well. When Kainan Wolfstep returned, his coat carried the scent of cold wind and dust. He shook it off by the door, set his gloves aside, and crouched beside her. His hands, rough from rope and work, adjusted the splint around her leg. It hurt, and she gasped despite herself. "Sorry," he muttered, voice low. It was the first time that word carried warmth. Their eyes met for a heartbeat, hers steady, his unreadable. and for the first time, she didn't look away. That night, when he again chose the chair by the table instead of the bed, she understood. He wouldn't sleep there while she was in the cabin, not out of discomfort, but because that bed belonged to ghosts he couldn't disturb. She no longer felt abandoned. The questions that had haunted the first nights now had answers. She knew his name, his loss, and the quiet reason behind his kindness. He hadn't saved her for reward or pity, he'd done it because grief had taught him what leaving someone behind truly meant. And though she had no words for it, Teya realized she wanted to trust him. In a world that had taken everything from her, trust was the last fragile bridge to survival. The wind outside howled through the cracks, rattling the shutters, as if to remind them the wilderness showed no mercy. Kainan rose before dawn, the scrape of his boots across the boards waking her. He stoked the fire, coaxing it back to life. Teya blinked through the haze of sleep, her body stiff, her leg aching with a dull throb. She watched him move with the rhythm of habit, every motion efficient, quiet, practiced. He poured coffee into a tin cup, set a kettle of water to boil, then looked over his shoulder. "You hungry?" His voice carried no edge this time, just simple concern. She nodded. He handed her a small plate of beans and bread, the same meal as his own. Teya ate slowly, still guarded, but her eyes stayed on him longer now. She wanted to know who he was when the silence wasn't filling the air between them. Questions lingered like ghosts. Why she hadn't tried to crawl away when he left to check the fence line, why she stayed under the roof of a stranger. The answer was simple. Out there was only hunger, cold, and the kind of loneliness that killed slower than pain. Here she had warmth food, and a man who had carried her instead of leaving her. For now, that was enough. When he finished his plate, he sat beside her and checked the binding on her leg again. His hands were steady, careful. She winced as the cloth tightened. "Better than yesterday," she managed. "It'll hold," he said. "Won't heal fast, but it will heal." After a pause, he added, "I've set breaks before horses, mostly, but close enough." It was the closest thing he'd offered to conversation. When he stepped outside to fetch wood, Teya's eyes wandered once more to the larger bed across the room. Its blanket was folded too neatly. She'd noticed how his hand always touched the chain around his neck when she mentioned family, how he never looked at the bed itself. Now she understood it wasn't just an empty place to sleep. It was a shrine to a life he couldn't touch again. That explained the chair he chose every night. His distance wasn't from her, it was from his past. When Kainan came back inside, snow dusted his coat. She didn't look directly at him when she asked, "Your wife? You don't sleep in her bed anymore, do you?" His boots stilled on the boards. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he set down the wood, pulled off his gloves, and said quietly, "Not since she passed." Couldn't. The words hung heavy in the air, stripped bare of emotion, yet filled with everything he didn't say. Teya touched the beads at her neck and understood. Loss had carved him as deeply as it had carved her. Her fear of him, of what men could do, began to fade. He wasn't a threat. He was a man learning how to exist with his grief. The day stretched slow. Kainan mended a broken hinge on the door, patched a crack in the wall, kept the fire burning strong. Teya helped where she could, washing the tin plates from her cot hands, clumsy but determined. At one point, she asked softly, "Why did you stop that day when you saw me?" He didn't look up from the table. The silence stretched long enough she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Because once, nobody stopped for me. It wasn't much, but it was enough to break the cold stillness between them. For the first time she understood they were two people bound by loss, both pulled back from the edge by the smallest flicker of mercy. While cutting thin strips of jerky over the table, Kainan Wolfstep finally spoke, his tone quiet but firm. "Because I couldn't walk away again." Teya Windriver didn't ask for more. She didn't need to. That night, as the fire sank low and shadows stretched across the walls, she shifted under the blanket. Pain from her leg pulsed deep, a reminder of how fragile her body still was. Still, she whispered softly into the quiet, "Thank you for not leaving me." The words were barely a breath, yet heavy with everything she'd never said before. Kainan looked at her, the faint firelight catching the scar that ran along his jaw. He gave a slow nod. "You're safe here," he said the first time he'd spoken those words aloud. For her, that was enough. She let her eyes close, letting sleep come without fear that the door might open to danger. The questions that had haunted the first nights, why she stayed, why he hadn't sent her away, why the bed remained untouched, all had found quiet answers. The truth was simple and rough-edged, but real, and in this hard, lonely world that was enough. The next morning arrived colder than the last. Frost lined the window, and the basin beyond the cabin lay still beneath a pale, tired sun. Kainan moved through his routine in silence, feeding the fire, boiling coffee, checking supplies, stacked neatly against the wall. Teya watched him, realizing how easily his rhythm had become familiar, almost predictable. But unease still stirred inside her. She didn't know if he meant to send her away once her leg healed, or if the men who had shoved her from the ridge were still out there waiting. Worse yet, she didn't know what lived inside this man's silence, anger, grief, or something she hadn't yet learned to name. He brought her a plate of bread and beans, the same simple meal as before. She accepted it now, without hesitation, her pride softened by gratitude. When she finished, he checked her splint, again tightening the cloth with steady, calloused fingers. "Bones holding," he said. "Still weak. Few more weeks before you walk proper." The words hit harder than she expected. Weeks that meant she'd be trapped here in his cabin, tied to his mercy. She wasn't sure whether that frightened her or comforted her. When he stepped outside to fetch water from the barrel, she studied the cabin again. She noticed new details, the rifle leaning against the far wall, a saddle stacked neatly by the door, and a small wooden box resting on the shelf above the untouched bed. The life of a man who lived alone, yet never quite left the past behind. When he returned, she finally asked, "Why not live in town? Arroyo Ford's not far." Her tone was calm, not prying, just curious. Kainan set the water down and sat at the table. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then, in his steady, gravel-rough voice, he said, "Town's full of eyes. Folks there want stories. I don't have any worth tellin'." As he spoke, his hand brushed the chain at his chest, the one that held Lyra Sunvale's wedding ring beneath his shirt. The motion was small, but told her everything she needed to know. She didn't press further. She had already learned that silence could speak truer than words. The day crawled by slow. Kainan worked outside, chopping wood and tightening the fence posts near the shed. Teya, stubborn and restless, mended one of his shirts from her cot. Her hands were clumsy, but she kept at it, threading the needle with grit in her jaw. When he came back in the smell of cold air clinging to him, he noticed what she was doing. "Didn't have to," he said. "I'll do what I can," she replied softly. "I won't just lie here doing nothing." He gave a small nod, approval glinting in his eyes. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. That evening, as they sat in the soft glow of the fire, the world outside reminded them it still lingered. A faint shout drifted from beyond the ridge, distant but real. Teya froze her fingers, gripping the beads at her neck. Kainan stood instantly, the revolver already in his hand before she'd even drawn breath. He moved to the window, eyes narrowed, body coiled with caution. The shouts faded, swallowed by the wind, but he waited several long minutes before lowering his gun. "They'll come back," Teya said quietly, voice trembling but certain. "The men who pushed me, they don't forget." Kainan turned his stare steady and hard. "Let him try," he said. "This land's mine, this cabin's mine, and you're safe here." This time his words didn't sound like comfort. They sounded like a vow. Teya studied him, realizing it wasn't talk. The way he stayed between her and the door, the revolver still at his side, it was all proof enough. For the first time, she recognized what his silence had become. Not distance, but protection. Later that night, as he sat once more in his chair by the table, she whispered into the quiet. "You could have left me. You still could." "Why don't you?" Kainan leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes lost in the firelight. His voice came slow, almost roughened by memory. "Because I know what it is to be left." He didn't add another word he didn't need to. Teya lay back, her leg throbbing, but her heartbeat steady for the first time since the fall. The fire crackled softly, and outside the wind howled across the ridge. Inside, for once, she felt something close to peace. The questions that had lingered in Teya Windriver's mind, why Kainan Wolfstep lived alone, why he hadn't turned her out, what he would do if those men ever came back, finally carried their answers. The truth was plain. He would not leave her. And if trouble came, he'd stand between her and it, not out of obligation, but because that was the only way he still knew how to live. That night the fire burned low, and the wind pressed hard against the cabin walls, but something in the air had shifted. Neither of them was truly alone anymore. They didn't speak it, but both felt it. Morning came sharp and bitter. Frost clung to the window like white lace, and the water bucket by the door had a thin crust of ice. Kainan moved with his usual quiet rhythm, feeding the fire, setting a pan of beans and a small pot of coffee on the stove. Every movement was steady, familiar, yet his shoulders carried tension that hadn't been there before. The distant shouts from the night before hadn't left his mind. Danger wasn't a memory now, it was close enough to taste. Teya woke with a start as the fire crackled. Pain flared through her leg deeper than before, stiffness creeping into her hip. She pushed herself upright, the effort drawing lines across her face. The blanket slid from her shoulder, revealing the torn seam of her dress. She pulled his shirt tighter around herself, hating how weakness seemed stitched into her every breath. She despised that feeling vulnerability, but swallowed it down and lifted her chin. Kainan set a small plate on the stool beside her bread beans, a strip of jerky. The meals never changed, but they kept her alive. She ate slowly, her pride softening under necessity. As he poured his coffee, she noticed the revolver gleaming on the table, freshly cleaned. He must have worked on it through the night. Her chest tightened. "These men, the ones who pushed me," she asked quietly, "do you know them?" He looked across the firelight, his jaw tightening. "No names," he said. "Seen their kind. Drifters. They ride through Arroyo Ford sometimes. Spend what they steal. Move on. Town don't ask questions." The answer wasn't comforting, but it told her enough. He wasn't one of them. He hadn't known them. The thought that had haunted her, whether he was somehow tied to her attackers, eased for the first time. After breakfast, Kainan pulled on his coat and stepped outside to check the fence line. Fear settled over her the moment he left. She hated it, hated how dependent she had become. But if those men returned while he was gone, she couldn't even stand, let alone fight. She ran her fingers over the beads at her neck, her mother's last gift, whispering a prayer she barely remembered. When Kainan came back, the look on his face made her stomach tighten. Found tracks, he said, dropping his gloves on the table. 3 horses. Fresh. Headed west, but close. Her blood ran cold. She saw their faces again, the sneers, the shove, the laughter as she fell. "They'll come," she murmured. "They'll want to finish it." He studied her, his dark eyes calm and steady. "Then they'll find me waiting." His words should have eased her, but instead they unsettled her. She realized she didn't know how far his quiet resolve could go, or how much violence lived beneath that silence. Her voice trembled. "Have you killed before?" He paused, his hand lifting to the chain around his neck, a gesture she had learned meant he was holding something back. The scar along his jaw caught the firelight as he finally said yes. War, and after, when a man's called to it. He looked down at his hands. "Not proud of it, but I've done it." Teya swallowed hard, eyes locked on his. "Would you do it again for me?" The cabin fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Kainan looked at her for a long moment, then said simply, "If it came to it." He didn't say it like a boast. It was a promise already decided. The hours dragged by as the wind howled outside. Kainan busied himself patching a loose board on the wall, sharpening his knife, anything to keep his hands occupied. Teya sat propped on the cot, sewing the torn seam of her dress with the thread he'd left her. Her hands trembled, but she worked carefully, closing the neckline stitch by stitch. When he glanced at her, she looked away, but he didn't need words to understand. His silence wasn't neglect, it was respect. That night when the fire burned low and shadows flickered across the cabin walls, Kainan moved his chair closer to the cot. He didn't speak, and neither did she. But in the quiet, their fears found a fragile peace, one guarded by firelight grief and the slow-growing trust between them. He had always kept his distance before guarding his grief, like a man guarding a wound that would never heal. But that night the sound of Teya Windriver's uneven breathing kept Kainan Wolfstep from retreating to the far corner. He sat near the cot instead, elbows resting on his knees, his revolver balanced loosely in one hand, his gaze fixed on the door. Through half-closed eyes, Teya watched him. The firelight caught the sharp lines of his face, the scar that spoke of old battles, and the quiet tension in his shoulders. "Why do you keep the ring?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft but steady. Kainan touched the chain beneath his shirt. "Reminds me who I was," he said quietly, "who I lost. And now." He exhaled, eyes falling to the dying fire. "Now it reminds me what not to forget, what not to let happen again." Teya lay back, pressing the beaded pouch against her heart, and a strange calm washed over her. For the first time she felt she wasn't just someone he pitied, or a burden he carried out of guilt. He had chosen her not in words or promises, but in the only way that mattered out here. He had chosen not to let her die. And every hour he stayed, every word he didn't say, proved he was still choosing her. The questions that had once haunted her, whether he'd known the men who hurt her, whether he'd fight for her, whether she was safe here, were answered now. The truth was hard, simple, and steady. He would fight if they came, and he would never let her be left behind again. As the fire faded to embers, Kainan leaned back in his chair, revolver resting across his lap, eyes still watching the door. Teya's breathing evened out, slipping into sleep. Her last thought before darkness claimed her was clear and fierce. She wasn't waiting to die anymore, she was waiting to live. Morning broke with an eerie stillness. The wind that had battered the cabin for days had gone quiet, leaving the basin hushed beneath a pale frozen sky. When Kainan stepped outside to fetch water, the air carried a strange weight, thick, tense, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He scanned the ridge, spotting fresh horse tracks pressed deep into the frozen dirt. They weren't his, and they weren't old. He didn't linger. Inside, Teya was already awake, propped up on the cot, alert despite the pain. As her strength returned, her fear had sharpened into something more focused. When he came back, she watched him closely. "You saw them," she said. "Tracks," he replied, setting the bucket down. "Close." Her hand flew to the beads at her neck, gripping them tight. She'd known this moment would come. The men who had shoved her from the ridge wouldn't leave unfinished business behind. "What will you do when they come?" she asked quietly. Kainan met her gaze, the firelight cutting across the scar on his jaw. "Stand in their way," he said. His words were simple, but the weight in his eyes told her everything. He had already made peace with the fight. Years of loss had taught him what it meant to have someone to protect again. The day dragged under a heavy stillness. Kainan sharpened his knife, checked the revolver, and took the rifle from its place against the wall. He moved differently now, measured alert. This wasn't a man tending chores. This was a man preparing for violence. Teya watched him work her pulse, quick and unsteady. She'd wondered more than once why she hadn't tried to crawl away when he was gone. Why she stayed with a stranger whose silence was as thick as the winter air. But now she knew leaving would mean crawling out into empty land, broken and helpless, waiting for death to find her. And more than that, she stayed because she trusted him. His quiet wasn't threat. It was restraint. His distance wasn't coldness, it was respect. He never crossed the line it would have been easy to cross. That restraint again and again was what had earned her faith. By late afternoon, Kainan came back inside carrying more than wood. He dropped a small leather pouch on the table. Inside, Teya saw strips of dried venison and a handful of rifle cartridges. He had been preparing, not hoping danger would pass, but readying for when it returned. As darkness fell, they shared another silent meal by the fire. Earlier that day, Teya had stitched the neckline of her torn dress, clumsy but decent. When he noticed, he gave a small nod, quiet respect, flickering across his face. For the first time, she felt something like pride. She wasn't just a wounded stranger anymore. She was surviving. Then, as the fire settled low, the first sound reached them, hoofbeats, faint but steady, drifting across the frozen basin. Teya froze. The air in the cabin thickened. Kainan rose slowly, the legs of his chair scraping against the wood. He crossed to the window, pushed the shutter open just a crack, and peered into the darkness. The sound grew louder. The storm they'd both been waiting for was finally coming. 3 horses, the same number as before. They were back. "They're here," Kainan Wolfstep said quietly, his voice calm, but edged with steel. His hand was already reaching for the rifle, leaning by the door. Teya Windriver's heart slammed against her ribs. 100 questions rose at once. What would he do? Could the cabin hold? Would he live through this? But she swallowed them down. Her voice trembled when she finally asked, Why did they push me? What do they even want?" Kainan didn't hesitate. "Control," he said flatly. Men like that don't need reason. They take because it makes them feel like they own the air everyone else breathes. The truth hit harder than the memory of the fall. It wasn't her weakness that had left her broken at the bottom of that ridge, it was their cruelty. But this time, she wasn't facing it alone. Outside, hoofbeats slowed, circling the cabin. Then a voice called out, rough mocking. "You in there, Wolfstep? We saw your tracks. Heard you got yourself some company." Kainan didn't answer. He moved to the door, his rifle in hand, revolver within easy reach. Before stepping closer, he looked back at Teya. His tone dropped to a low, even command. "Stay down. No matter what happens, stay down." Her fingers tightened around her beads until they bit into her palm. She nodded, her throat dry, the truth of his warning sinking deep. Outside, laughter rolled through the cold air. Men trying to sound fearless, their voices cruel and hungry. But Kainan wasn't a man who got pulled into noise. He had buried his wife and son in silence. He had lived with ghosts longer than these men had lived with courage. He opened the door only when he was ready. The cold rushed in, and with it danger. Then the door shut behind him. Teya's heart thundered as muffled voices rose outside, harsh, taunting, then lower, steadier Kainan's voice. She couldn't make out every word, but she didn't need to. His tone told her what mattered. This wasn't a man bargaining. This was a man standing his ground. Her breath trembled as she lay back on the cot. Pain burned through her leg, but she pressed through it, whispering words her mother, Sahi Moonpetal, had once spoken. "Strength isn't leaving, it's staying." And she prayed that when morning came, the man outside would still be standing. The wind outside had gone still, the kind of stillness that meant something terrible was about to happen. Teya could hear the horses snorting restless in the dirt. The men's voices carried low and cruel, the kind of men who thought no one would ever tell them no. She clutched the blanket to her chest with one hand and the beads at her neck with the other. Her leg throbbed with every noise, a harsh reminder that she couldn't move, couldn't run, couldn't help. Kainan stood on the other side of that thin wooden door, rifle. Ready body, steady as stone. For years, the cabin had been his refuge. Tonight, it was his fortress. He had told her little about the war, but the way he held himself said enough. He was a man who had faced death before and learned how to look it in the eye. Outside, one of the men called again. "Wolfstep. We know she's in there. That girl's ours. Hand her over, and maybe we'll let you keep breathing." Their laughter followed, ugly, sharp, full of arrogance. Teya's stomach twisted. She had known cruelty before, but hearing them talk about her like property made her blood run cold. Kainan's reply cut through the night like thunder. "She's not yours. She's under my roof. You ride on, or you don't ride at all." The silence that followed was thick and dangerous. Then came footsteps, slow, heavy boots, crunching on frozen dirt. Teya gripped the cot, whispering words her mother had once taught her: hold. Stay. Endure. Then the first gunshot tore through the night, a pistol fired too early by a nervous hand. The bullet smashed into the wall, splintering inches from the window. Kainan didn't flinch. He lifted his rifle, took aim, and fired once. A scream followed one man down. Horses reared hooves, kicking dirt, their fear echoing through the basin. Another shot cracked through the dark, closer this time. The bullet shattered part of the doorframe, showering splinters across the floor. Kainan moved like a soldier, precise, unshaken. He kicked the door wider, stepped just far enough into the open, and fired again. Another cry split the night. Now only one rider remained. His voice broke with panic. "You'll die for her, Wolfstep. You think you can keep her. She ain't worth it." Inside the cabin, Teya clutched her beads, her pulse trembling against her fingertips. The man outside didn't understand to Kainan Wolfstep. She wasn't a burden. She was the reason he'd found something worth living and fighting for again. Kainan Wolfstep's voice was calm, low, and deadly steady. Worth more than you ever were. The last exchange was quick, brutal. One of the riders fired blindly into the dark, and Kainan answered with a single clean shot. Silence followed, broken only by the whimper of the wounded and the restless snort of the horses. He stood still for a long moment, rifle lowered, but ready, listening, making sure it was done. Then he stepped back inside and shut the door behind him with deliberate weight. Teya Windriver stared at him, her chest rising fast, the clash of fear and relief shaking through her. Kainan's face was pale in the firelight, carved with exhaustion, but steady. He leaned the rifle against the wall, set his revolver on the table, and said in a voice rough from smoke and cold, "It's over." Teya's eyes filled before she could stop them. "They would have killed you," she whispered. "For me." He shook his head. "Not for you, for the kind of men they were. I wasn't going to let them finish what they started." His eyes softened. "And I wasn't going to let you die." The firelight caught the faint glint of the ring beneath his shirt, the same one that had hung heavy on his chest since the day she met him. She saw now it wasn't just grief he carried. It was purpose. She wanted to ask if he was ready to let the ghosts rest, to stop living in the shadow of death, but she held her tongue. Some truths weren't spoken. They were lived. Instead, her voice came small, careful. "Will you send me away when my leg heals?" He looked at her long and hard, his scar pulling tight across his jaw. "You think I went through all this to see you leave?" The words hit deeper than she expected. She lay back on the cot, clutching the blanket to her chest, her beads pressing against her heart. For the first time since the fall, she breathed without fear. She knew those men outside would never rise again. And she knew she wasn't just some burden in his cabin. She was wanted here not as a debt, not as pity, but as someone worth fighting for. Every question that had lingered what those men intended, whether Kainan would risk his life for her, whether she was safe, had been answered under the weight of gunfire and smoke. The land outside still held danger, but inside for the first time there was peace. The fire burned low, filling the air with the heavy scent of powder and ash. Kainan sat back in his chair, revolver resting across his lap. His eyes, once fixed on the door, now lingered on her instead. Teya met his gaze, and in that quiet something shifted again. They were no longer just survivor and savior. They were bound now by choice, by blood spilled by the decision to stay. At dawn, the basin lay still, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Thin smoke drifted from the chimney, curling into a pale sky. The bodies outside lay where they had fallen motionless in the frost. Kainan stepped out, shovel in hand. He was a man who understood that even enemies deserved to be buried, not left for the wolves. It wasn't forgiveness. It was duty. Hours later, he came back inside, sweat cutting lines through the dust on his face. He said nothing about the graves, only set the shovel by the door and checked the fire. Teya hadn't slept much. The gunfire still echoed in her mind, the flash of light, the sound of his voice standing against the men who wanted her dead. Now, as she watched him move with quiet purpose, she saw him differently. He wasn't just the solitary widower who had pulled her from the rocks. He was the man who had chosen to fight for her without hesitation. She pulled his flannel shirt closer around her shoulders. It smelled of smoke and leather of him, and for the first time it didn't make her feel ashamed. It made her feel safe. Still, the questions came the kind anyone would wonder. Could she stay here once she healed? Would he even want her to? Or was she just a responsibility he couldn't walk away from? And what would the town of Arroyo Ford say if they learned an Apache woman was living under his roof? Kainan poured her a cup of water and set it by her cot. "You need to start moving that leg," he said. His tone was gruff but not unkind. "If it stiffens, you'll limp the rest of your life." She looked up at him. "And when I can walk again, will you send me away?" His hand brushed the chain at his chest, the ring pressing against the fabric. He had dodged that question before. "Not this time. You don't have to go unless you want to," he said finally. "This cabin's big enough for two." The words were plain, but they landed like a promise. Her throat tightened. She thought of the ridge of those men who had spoken of her like property, and of the way Kainan had spoken of her instead. Not as something to own, but someone he refused to abandon. "And if the town comes asking?" She pressed softly. Kainan sat back, the firelight tracing the line of his scar. "Town's opinion don't count in this cabin," he said. "They weren't here when my wife was dying. They didn't stand by when I buried my boy. They don't get a say now." His words settled deep in her chest, heavy and sure. For the first time, Teya Windriver believed that she wasn't just surviving in this cabin, she was home. She had once feared the shadow of the world beyond those cabin walls, feared that even if Kainan Wolfstep wanted her there, the world outside would find a way to tear it apart. But he had spoken like a man who had already made his choice, and that choice had been her. Days blurred into a week, Teya Windriver's strength grew little by little. Kainan crafted her a crutch from a smooth pine branch, fixing 2 crosspieces with his steady hands, before pressing it into hers without a word. Each day she pushed herself, hobbling from one end of the cabin to the other, her jaw tight with pain, but her eyes shining with stubborn fire. He watched her quietly stepping close, only when she faltered. Their hands brushed more often now, those brief touches lingering just long enough to say what neither dared to speak aloud. One evening, when she made it the full length of the cabin without stumbling, Kainan said, in that deep, quiet tone of his, "Proud of you." The words were simple, but they carried more weight than 1,000 speeches. Teya's throat tightened. "You gave me a reason," she whispered. From that moment, something changed between them. The air no longer felt heavy with grief. It carried warmth instead. They began eating together at the table rather than apart. She mended his shirts, her fingers no longer trembling from weakness. He stopped sitting in the chair beside her bed and started sleeping again on his own cot, though not before making sure she was comfortable first. The cabin that had once echoed with loneliness began to breathe again. One night, with the fire burning low and shadows dancing across the log walls, Teya reached across the table and brushed his hand. Kainan went still, startled by the softness of a touch he hadn't felt in years. She met his eyes, her voice steady despite the thrum in her chest. "You saved me not just from them, but from being alone." His hand turned fingers closing around hers, rough and warm. The ring beneath his shirt pressed faintly against his chest, but for once, he didn't reach for it. He let it rest where it was, his attention fixed on her. "You gave me back something I thought I'd buried," he said quietly. Her breath caught. She leaned closer, their faces only inches apart. The fire's glow painted his scar in gold and shadow. When their lips met, the kiss came tentative at first, as if both had forgotten how, then deepened with the ache of years spent in silence. Her hand clutched his shoulder, his arm slid around her back, strong and steady. It wasn't desire that pulled them together. It was survival. Trust. The shared vow of 2 people who had decided not to turn away from life again. When they finally drew apart, she whispered, "Then I'll stay, if you'll have me." He looked at her eyes, soft beneath the firelight. "You're here now," he said. That's enough. By spring, her leg had healed enough for her to walk without the crutch. She still moved carefully, but she carried herself tall proud, her spirit unbroken. Together, they repaired the fence lines, mended the roof, and tilled the soil for planting. From time to time, folks from Arroyo Ford rode by. Some looked on with suspicion, others with curiosity, but none dared to challenge Kainan Wolfstep. He stood at the gate every time, calm and unyielding. The quiet rancher who had lived for years in silence was no longer alone. The cabin glowed with more than firelight. Every evening, 2 plates sat on the table. The cot across the room was no longer cold and distant. In the evenings, Teya sang soft songs in her mother's tongue, words Sahi Moonpetal had once taught her beneath starlit skies. Kainan listened, head bowed, the sound of her voice mending places grief had hollowed out. The story that began with cruelty and a fall from the ridge did not end in sorrow. It ended in life renewed. The scarred widower and the proud, resilient Apache woman had found what both had lost long ago: family. And for the first time in years, when Kainan's eyes drifted to the untouched bed across the room, the one where Lyra Sunveil had once slept, he did not look away in pain. He turned toward Teya Windriver instead.